All right, we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I appreciate you joining a webinar today about understanding the customer journey and creating shopping experiences that convert. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Dan Fertig, and I look after partnerships for SCAYLE. SCAYLE is an enterprise commerce platform that serves B2C retailers and brands who are looking to differentiate on customer experience. In the webinar today, before we get started, I'll run through just a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, this will be recorded and available upon request. If you have colleagues that were hoping to join and are unable to, or you want to refer back to any piece of content, obviously you'll be able to do so. Number two, please do feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A form. We will hopefully reserve time for questions at the end and would love to get to as many as possible. And number three, if there are questions that you have that we don't get to respond to, you'll have our contact information at the end of this webinar, and hopefully we get to hear from you and continue the dialogue after this concludes today. The content of this webinar will revolve in large part around the recent shopper survey performed by SCAYLE. For those that are unaware, SCAYLE surveyed nearly 1,600 respondents with more than 100 questions across four age categories and demographics: Gen Z, Gen Y, Gen X, and Boomers. So why did we perform this survey? Well, in conversations with those retailers, we found that a number of them were losing customers and suffering in conversion from hidden pain points in the shopper's journey. Okay. And the issues plaguing those brands and retailers, they might not show up in your KPIs. They might be due to missing payment options or rigid return policies, misaligned values. These are the factors that can frustrate shoppers enough to make them walk away and potentially never return. So we set out to understand what they really think. What do those consumers think when they abandon brands? And as a leading e-commerce platform provider that serves a number of different customers, we did partner with YouGov to survey those shoppers in the US about why they were abandoning those brands and what keeps them loyal in return. What we found was super interesting. If you've not read the report or downloaded the report, I invite you to do so with the QR code there. Towards the end of this webinar, I'm actually going to go through many of the key takeaways, the items that we found as pain points, and some of the potentially cures that go into fixing those pain points as well. To get started, it's my pleasure to welcome up two experts to the panel here. I'm pleased and excited to introduce Steve Dennis, a strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author, and Tarek Müller, co-founder and co-CEO of About You Group. Gentlemen, I would invite you, maybe starting with Steve, to do a quick introduction, please.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here, and thanks for everybody for joining. Well, let's see the quick overview. I've spent almost my entire career in retail one way or another. The first half of it really on the operating side. I was on the senior leadership team at two large retailers, both running businesses, but spending a lot of time on growth strategy, innovation, those kinds of things. Probably among the first people to work in what we now call omnichannel. I headed multi-channel integration at a large retailer starting way back in 1999. And then for the last, I guess, almost 15 years now, I've been doing strategic advisory work. That's morphed into keynote speaking. I host the #1 retail podcast globally, and I've written a couple of books.
Thank you. Tough act to follow. Tarek, over to you.
Yeah, tough to be after Steve. So I'm Tarek. I founded my first online shop, I think 20 years ago, more or less exactly 20 years ago. Actually bootstrapped my first online shops when this was still possible. And then I've sold that company that was basically building and operating online shops in niche categories. I've sold that company 2011, where it basically became clear that Amazon is taking over most of the smaller niche categories. And then I've started About You 2013, so 11 years ago. About You is an online fashion store active in Europe. We are in 28 countries here in continental Europe. We are market leader in roughly half of them. And yeah, we grew from 0 to 5 billion in GMV and within those 11 years, equaling roughly 2 billion in IFRS net revenue. I took the company public 2021, and we are in the process of merging it with a competitor at the moment. And then in 2019, I had the pleasure to co-found SCAYLE, which you have already introduced then. So a little bit kind of being both operator of online shops for the past 20 years, obviously about you being the by far largest, but also helping other brands and retailers through technology to grow profitably digitally.
Love it. And a wealth of experience, of course, from both of you, both operational experience, but then kind of where your paths started and kind of one merged into strategic advisory, one merged into, the software that can serve other brands effectively as well. So really good rounded breadth of experience. Why don't I start with a question for Steve, and I put it up here on the screen. In your writing and even on your podcast, I hear you talk quite a bit about the need to understand customer journey. So maybe quick
Right.
two-parter, how do you think and define customer journey, and why is this so important for brands to lean into?
Well, the way I think about customer journey is mostly really what are those steps starting all the way back, perhaps from the point of even thinking about buying something, all the way through to buying it and potentially servicing it, if it's that, kind of the life cycle of a product or service. And at the risk of stating the obvious, if you don't understand the customer journey and how you're doing at all those moments that matter, you don't really know what to work on. And so I think it's always been important to understand, how people get interested in your product, how they get to your store, get to your site, what makes them convert, et cetera, et cetera. What I think is particularly important now is things have been really changing a lot over the last several years. Obviously, the whole digital shopping piece of the journey, but even, we used to talk about back when I first got started, discovering the product mostly happened in a store or maybe happened watching a TV ad or something, right? Now you've got discovered on TikTok or you've got discovered on social media. So the nature of the shopping journeys have changed a lot. And I often find that retailers don't stay on top of how journeys are changing, particularly for younger customers or the customers they're trying to acquire.
Got it. And Tarek, maybe for you, how do you think differently about customer journey? What makes the way you approach it unique?
Yeah, I agree with everything Steve said. And he said it often starts when the customer thinks about buying something. And I would argue that in a lot of categories, at least, you can even start earlier, basically trying to implement the idea of wanting to buy something. And I have the feeling that Amazon's success actually kind of built the framework on how online shops are built for a very long period. But Amazon, to me, is a digitized warehouse. And Amazon is world class in fulfilling the demand one has. But Amazon is really not good in kind of creating demand or inspiring. But I think especially in lifestyle categories, so in fashion and beauty and home decor, but also in a couple of other fields, I think retailers can also try to at least become a destination that is also visited by its customers when there's no demand, but also to kill time in a way. Yeah. TikTok was also mentioned. I mean, TikTok is a huge e-commerce platform that only serves customers that basically buy something out of an impulse. Yeah. So I would add to everything Steve said, which I 100% agree with, that there is an opportunity, I believe, for an e-commerce player to become more than just a digitized warehouse. And even brands can actually use that opportunity. For example, Nike with its running app. I mean, that is basically an app that comes before the idea of I want to buy something, but it keeps the customer touch point alive. And we all know that we are so overwhelmed with advertisement. It is important to stay in the relevant set of the customer. And I think a way to stay in the relevant set of the customer, to then be present when a customer thinks about buying something, is also to start before the customer thinks about buying and kind of serving or solving a problem that the customer has. In case of Nike or Adidas, for example, it's basically having a cool app to track running, etc. Yeah. And in about use case, it's a bit like being a digitized fashion magazine where our users in the Gen Y, Gen Z, after clicking through their Instagram feed, their TikTok feed, might open the About You app and just stroll around basically and get inspired.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. Steve mentioned this, how customer journey really used to be, prior to maybe 2010, about what is that in-store experience like. 2010 to 2020, it was, what is my customer experience to a lot of people was, well, what is my actual like owned.com experience like? And so many of these purchasing decisions, the exploration, the discovery that you called it, Tarek, is actually happening before they ever get to your glass, before they ever get to your branded properties. So you have to start to really think a little bit more top of funnel, just as much as you need to think about, adding to cart and the PDP and the checkout conversion as well. So maybe a good shift then, it can feel overwhelming if you're a brand that's not being strategic about this today. Steve, what advice would you give on, how to create a framework, to
Yeah.
surface opportunities and start to define what an optimized customer journey looks like?
Well, so I'll give a little bit of kind of the perfect world and then try to get a little
Great.
bit more pragmatic. I think the main thing to keep in mind is you need to treat different customers differently. So starting with a sense of the different customer segments you serve is usually fairly helpful. Now, in a perfect world, you'd have this very elaborate customer segmentation and ability to track all these things. But you may have customers that are very, very price sensitive, or very, very fashion sensitive, or very, very tech specification centric. But having that kind of in mind when you're thinking about going through the customer journeys is super helpful. And then thinking through the different sort of purchase occasions. The one I like to use a lot is what I call the difference between shopping and buying. Buying being very functional. So if I'm just trying to get something off of my to-do list, looking for the best price, tends to be convenience driven. But then like what Tarek was talking about, more of a shopping thing, that's more storytelling, it's more discovery, may invest a lot of different times. So the more you can kind of intersect the type of customer and the type of job they're trying to get done, that's usually helpful to frame things. And then the other part is really to just think about, as not to be engineering about it, particularly since I'm not an engineer, is to think about this as a throughput equation. There's all these gates the customers go through, from what we were talking about earlier, that more discovery process, is starting to think about it, to, okay, now I want to buy a coat for the trip I'm going on. Where am I going to get information about that? And then how am I
Mhm.
doing at every stage of that process? So some broad framework like that is super helpful. Trying to do that in detail, of course, could be massively complicated and expensive. So sometimes I just say, like, just let's map this out at a high level. We probably all have a sense of where we know we have opportunities, or maybe we don't have enough data. Like, do we really know how well we're doing on converting customers? So I think I would just try to frame it up in a way, try to pick what you think are leverage points, and at least use that to get started. But yeah, in a perfect world, you do something more research based and more comprehensive. But for most companies, that's not really practical.
That's great.
And I mean, I completely agree. Um, what what we often see is that companies struggle a little bit with the complexity on executing on that. And what I typically tell them is, hey, start with easy customer groups. Yeah, it doesn't need to be 100 different customer groups that you try to box your customers in. Yeah, so for example, at About You, we in the very beginning really started with basically 3 customer groups. Are you fashion forward, a little bit late, or whatever? Yeah, and then obviously over time we extended it and trying to kind of understand, as Steve said, okay, what is the customer looking for? What kind of customer is it? And what would be the next best action that we could take to serve basically whatever the customer is looking for? And we are adding basically 2 data points at the moment, is kind of deciding what we show the customer. One is the profitability score. I mean, if it's an existing customer, because profitability for our customers is really very different. Depending on how sale, price they are, etc., etc. And then we have what we call a liveness score. The liveness score basically says how likely is it that the customer will buy organically, or is the customer at risk of churning? And that determines for us whether we give extra incentives like coupons, promotion codes, vouchers, etc. And then the combination of, okay, this is the right product and content we should show. This is how profitable the customer actually is, and then combined with the liveness score, basically decides whether we put a promotion on top of it or not.
Yeah, and if I could add one other thing I meant to mention earlier, it's very important to realize that not just go down the e-commerce channel or the store channel, because we know many times customers are researching online before going to the store and vice versa. So it's obviously very common, particularly on mobile devices, for customers to be going back and forth between different contact points, different touch points. So that adds to the complexity, but it is very important, because I just see a lot of companies make the mistake by getting just focused on the e-commerce experience and say like, oh, how well are we converting? Well, if the customer is using your website to go to the store, you're not measuring conversion the right way. So I'm not saying this is easy, but you need to be very careful that you're not getting a false sense of security that you're working on the right problem, because you haven't really opened the aperture on thinking about the customer journey and the different ways people end up navigating their way through to the ultimate transaction.
Yeah, that's great. The more you can understand if somebody purchases on both, starts in one channel, converts in the other, and vice versa, I think is obviously a critical place to get started as well, especially obviously if you're doing both brick and mortar as well as digital, as most are nowadays. So Tara, coming back to you quickly, from an operator's perspective, where are you seeing as the most efficient ways to reduce customer churn and increase loyalty of your customers? You talked about just starting by identifying which bucket they fall into potentially, which is eye-opening. But maybe even taking it one step further, what are some of the low-hanging fruit and the action items you're taking and your team is taking?
I mean, it's a good loyalty program that runs omni-channel, I think solves the problem that we were just discussing. Kind of how do you bridge um, the data inside, whether someone maybe researched online and then purchased offline. If you have a loyalty program that basically serves both channels and the customers logged in online, then it is at least measurable. And I think if you're an omni-channel player, I think I would just, emphasize what Steve said, a customer that doesn't buy online is not necessarily a customer that churned. It might also be a customer just researched online but bought offline. Yeah. And I mean, that is often, if you don't have a proper omni-channel functionality going, that is often such a blind spot. Yeah. Also when it comes to the question on churn. Yeah. So, but that is obviously not easy to have a loyalty program that runs both channels and to nudge the customer to be logged in online. I mean, that is not easy. I know that. But I think there are ways to also incentivize that, yeah. And a way to incentivize it could be that if you have a loyalty program, for example, that runs with points, which in most cases is the case, that you basically say, hey, every time you log in, you get a point, yeah. Or you have early access to specific things if you are logged in and you have tier 2 or whatever, yeah. You can see special coupons if you are logged in. So I think it is important to actually get the customer to log in, to also kind of have the data connection. And then generally, as I've just mentioned, I mean, for us at least, there was a huge lever in basically not giving everyone the same voucher or coupon, but really measuring this, what we now call a liveness score, basically understanding when there's a risk for churn and when not. Because if you give a coupon or a voucher to someone that would buy anyways, then it's not incremental. So you just cannibalize your margin. If you don't do that and you save on the cannibalization, then you have more to invest in those that are really at risk to churn. And by this, you can in total optimize your customer file significantly. And therefore, we have invested a lot technologically in what we call advanced promotions. So basically, the ability to really understand on your customer file what are the products or the categories that would be incremental. So someone that, for example, always buys clothing, has never bought kids assortment, and then you give has a kid, you give a kids coupon that is to a large degree incremental then. Yeah, if someone that regularly buys the same category and you just give a voucher, then they will continue to buy in that category, and it's just a cannibalization of your profit contribution. So really understanding basically what is the next best action that would be incremental, and
Mhm.
when is the right time to give a coupon and when is not the right time to give a coupon. And if you do that, you save so much on the basically safe cannibalized profit contribution that you can invest much more in reactivating your churn customers or those that are at risk to churn.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's an opportunity, especially what you described around identifying what are the products or categories that are incremental. It's entirely possible a consumer associates your brand with a single category and it kind of opens their eyes. You increase share of wallet across other categories, kids and baby in the example you gave, rather than just apparel. And I know Steve will come back to you on a couple of retailers and brands that you think are doing loyalty really well today and then on the experience really well today as well. Maybe next question then. We've talked, Tarek talked a lot about like what are some of the more advanced things that you can do, especially with an omni-channel loyalty program. I've seen in your again in your writing and on your podcast, you talk about innovating the parity. You talk about confusing table stakes with differentiators. What does that mean to you? What should brands be aware of, and what are the risks associated there?
Well, I'll be very brief about this. One of the things, I guess the reason why I bring this up a lot is that there's kind of a narrative that, if you just kind of flawlessly execute, particularly about brands that are struggling, that this flawless execution will somehow save them or give them advantage. And I think, I sometimes inelegantly say sucking less is not a winning strategy. You should fix things that aren't working well. You should address the pain points, friction points, all those kinds of things. Absolutely. And that may give you a good lift. But in a world where companies or customers, I should say, have so many choices, customers don't switch just because you're equivalent. So yes, you need to close those gaps, but there's such a high level of execution, particularly on the part of companies like Amazon and Walmart and others, that just getting to parity with them is not going to give you competitive advantage. It might keep you in the game. So just understand that as you're focusing on, let's say, as you're dissecting the customer journeys, what are those things that get you to parity? But you really got to focus on what I call amplifying the wow. What are those things that really give you differentiation? So it's a very common mistake I see. And the other problem is if you address those gaps and you focus on closing them and it takes you 6 months, 12 months, whatever to get there, by the
Yeah.
time you close the gap, the best in class competitors have moved, right? So you're always chasing yourself. So just getting clarity around that and not kind of kidding yourself that those actions will get you to where you need to be. That's really the caution.
Yeah, I love that. It's plugging a hole may keep water from leaking out of the ship, but it won't
Right.
necessarily get new people wanting to jump on.
Yeah.
So I love that. And I mean, 6 months is an eternity these days in the way,
Right.
consumers shop. And so what I hear quite a bit, and it's so related to what you just described, Steve, is, a lot of brands are like, we see this other, company doing these types of promotions, or we see them offering, this type of, virtual reality, feature, and we want to go do that. And it's always the question of, well, do you know how widely adopted it is? Do you know if it's actually impacted conversion? Like, what are
Yeah.
the things actually worth chasing that are differentiated, and what are some of the fundamentals that you need to focus on as a business? So, who are some of those examples, Steve? I know you shared a couple with me in earlier conversations that you wanted to
Yeah.
go through. Who's amplifying the wow? Who's doing it differently? Who's doing more than just plugging the hole at the bottom of a ship?
Sure. Well, just very quickly, and there's a lot that are in store. I try to pick some that are more digital. And again, I think if you do the customer journey analysis, hopefully it allows you to say, okay, what are customers frustrated with, or what really might get customers to love our brand, as opposed to just think, oh, this is a sensible choice. So one that I really like is Warby Parker. I'm sure many people are familiar with Warby Parker if they're in the US and Canada anyway. They've become a very fast growing optical brand. And because they are more digital first, even though they do have, I think, close to or well over 200 stores, now they have this virtual try on and there's a very handsome guy there trying on, seeing how good he looks in some of their glasses. But they used to send, and this is, I know that they got to this, but they used to send 5 pairs to your home that you could try on, and a lot of people love that. But it added a lot of time, and of course, it added a lot of cost. So I think for them, they identified a friction point in terms of this is cumbersome, and sometimes we lose customers because of the time frame, no pun
Right.
intended. This is just a way to really help you visualize ultimately what you look at. And that's, of course, part of the wow experience is not only do the glasses help you see better, but you look good in them, right? Another that I think is really a product of looking at lots of pieces to the customer journey and really trying to find ways both to reduce friction as well as to create a wow experience is the Starbucks mobile app. You can run your Starbucks life to the extent you have one on this app because it keeps track of your loyalty points. It makes it super easy to redeem in a shopping cart for purchase. Obviously, you can order ahead. So there's just many pieces of this that speeds up the process, suggests upselling, cross-selling, develops loyalty, and they've almost been too successful because they've shifted so many orders to so they're having to deal with some other issues that have been developed out of the success of this. The third one I'd announce, and there's a lot of innovation, or I'd talk about, there's a lot of innovation in the beauty space. And in some respects, so I would say Sephora is a real leader here, as is Ulta and a couple of others. Similar to what I said about Starbucks, this is kind of managing your whole relationship with the brand on a mobile app, but also allowing you to do things like get personalized recommendations, interact with a beauty advisor, get the latest and greatest products. So really thinking about all those different aspects of what makes you loyal to the brand, but also drives profitable incrementality. And, obviously we're all tethered, or almost all of us are tethered to our mobile devices 24/7. So the more you can lean into how customers are just living their life and making it easy for them to interact with you and get done what they want to get done and create a wow experience, I think the better off you do.
Yeah, I love those examples. I think my wife is as tethered to the Sephora app as I am to the Starbucks app. And technically, only one of those two products has an actually addictive substance in them. So it's definitely a
As far
highly,
as as far as you know.
as far as I can tell. That's true. That's true. I don't always check the ingredients. So those some actually really tactical and fantastic feedback. What I thought I would do is, in the last 10 minutes before we turn it over to audience Q&A, I wanted to make sure for those that I'm sure have now downloaded the survey using the QR code that was presented but haven't yet gotten to review it. I did want to take us through some of the key takeaways, 4 key pain points, as well as some of the prescriptive advice and guidance we've given based on the feedback of those respondents. And then I'll invite you both to, share a point of view and a perspective on what particularly stands out to you from the survey results and some of the prescribed fixes. So the first key challenge identified is brand abandonment. And this was, again, nearly 1,600 respondents across 4 major, age demographics. 81% of US shoppers have abandoned a brand in the last year. And those are due to a lot of different reasons. I'll highlight some of the issues and then some of the treatments here as well. The first is product quality. Not a surprise that 2021 to 2024, frankly, there were a lot of manufacturing issues and delivery timeframe issues and challenges that retailers and brands were facing. A lot of that has ultimately been reflected down to product quality as well. Promotions and incentives was a big part of the reason or lack thereof why consumers might have abandoned brands. Product availability and assortment and range is both an issue as well as an opportunity. Politics was a surprise to me. Back in my teenage years when Michael Jordan used to say Republicans buy sneakers too, I, always kind of thought that was a joke. And this is not, a guidance to be apolitical as a brand or retailer. Ultimately, do what makes sense for your brand. But just know that, it is, I think, something like 11% of survey respondents said that they abandoned a brand due to their political issues. And so just be thoughtful, be mindful, be deliberate about it, and know that there will be consequences, both positive and potentially negative, if you're a retailer or a brand that chooses to take a political stance or one way or another. And then one that I think is well kind of discussed in our industry, which is payment options. The way people choose to pay now is so different than 10 years ago. And that's obviously, perhaps table stakes at this point, Steve. But certainly something that stood out is if you don't have a way for me to buy, while in bed at 10 p.m. while I'm scrolling on my phone, it's just not going to happen. I'm not getting out of bed to go get my credit card. Anything here, Steve, that stands out to you?
I mentioned two things quickly. I mean, I think for sure, I mean, I've heard some people say you're only as good as your customer's last great experience. And I think one of the things that's really different over the last decade is we all have experience with all sorts of kinds of companies. And so, if your shopping cart isn't as good as Amazon or your payment options aren't as good as Walmart or whatever it might be, then I might be out. And so you've got to sweat that, notwithstanding what I said about table stakes, you've got to sweat the basics. You've got to get it right. I think customers don't have a lot of tolerance for that because they have so many other choices. That is just the nature of the world. The other piece I think is more of a strategic issue, which is probably a different webinar, but a lot of the brands that are failing haven't picked a lane. They aren't the cheapest, most convenient, so they're getting outflanked by Costco, Walmart, TJX, et cetera. Or they don't offer anything different from a service or product standpoint. It's what I call the collapse of the unremarkable middle. And so a lot of companies, they may execute fine, but the question is, what is their reason for being? So I think that's a bigger strategic question. It's a little less about what I think this survey is getting at.
Great call out. Next one I'll highlight is challenge two, which is price sensitivity. And we saw this in the survey, even for luxury brands. There was a while there, going back to last year and the year prior, where luxury brands were rather resilient, even in the face of increased prices and inflation here in North America. Now we're starting to see some softening there, and so you can see, the question, how has the current uncertain economic climate changed your shopping behavior? 36% said that they now prioritize lower prices over brand loyalty. So what are some of the things that we can do? Increase the perceived value of your solution. Think of creative promotions, and those that don't necessarily impact margins so deeply as a straight discount. A loyalty program with teeth, which I know Tarek mentioned earlier, buy now, pay later options as a way to get consumers, able to transact on the products that they want on the economic terms they need, and then subscription options as well. Tarek, any point here or two that stands out to you as something that you want to double click on?
Not in particular, but I mean, more than 200 online shops that are doing more than 250 million annual revenue are running on SCAYLE, and then with About You, we are running a 5 billion online shop where we are serving 30 million customers that are actively buying. And what I regularly hear is that either companies or customers say, I'm not so price sensitive. But at the end of the day, if you A/B test it, everyone is price sensitive and is basically falling into the kind of trap of psychological triggers. And I wouldn't underestimate the value, even in the luxury segment, of psychological triggers. It doesn't necessarily always need to be a sale price. Could also be a free gift, early access, could be limited availability. I mean, in the luxury space, maybe kind of artificial limitation also works well. But I mean, these psychological triggers, they work extremely well. And just anecdotally, if you have a sale price and you combine that sale price with a countdown, I can tell you the conversion rate will be much higher. So kind of this, what you'd said with increased perceived value can also be, perceived limitation, FOMO in general, and this works for 100% of the customers, no matter in which segment you are active. So I think it's not always about really at the end of the day reducing price. Sometimes it is maybe about reducing price but selling it well, and sometimes it's really about psychological triggers to make someone buy.
That's really helpful and good advice on
And
the.
to be honest, and that's very unfortunate, but here China is doing it well. I mean, here I think, and when it comes to kind of gamification, psychological triggers, and kind of overselling something in terms of kind of how cheap it is compared to the value. Yeah, the Chinese players are doing a good job, unfortunately, in kind of, yeah, making a very low perceived price at a perceived high quality, where in fact often that is not the case. Yeah.
Yeah. Great feedback. Challenge 3. So we've touched on this topic here already. I know both Steve and Tarek touched on it. Consumers are multi-channel, and going through this survey, I was surprised. I know Steve was very surprised by some of the data here. How do you prefer to shop? You can see here 57% of consumers had a mix of online in store. Steve, what was your surprise here? Take us through, what you were thinking from, an omni-channel and multi-channel standpoint.
Well, one is and not to be too cute about it, but having had multi-channel in the title of my job when I was a senior vice president at Neiman Marcus. I don't think consumers are multi-channel. Consumers have been multi-channel for more than 20 years. The issue is most companies are siloed. And as a colleague of mine famously said, silos belong on farms. So this multi-channel activity, whether it's for research or what have you, has been extremely evident for a long, long time for most brands. So I don't think this is new. I think the wide the ubiquity of smart devices is called the blurring of the lines, but a brand is one thing. Consumers buy a brand, and how they shop and interact, varies for sure. So I think, you have to embrace the blur of shopping that has been evident and is only growing. So whether it's 57% or whatever, I think the key thing, the actionable thing strategically is to break down those silos, be customer centric, not channel centric. Do as was talked about earlier. I mean, attribution and the ability to deliver on this is not easy, but you have to embrace that and do the best you can, and push on that and really come at it from a customer. I always say the customer is the channel. All this other channel stuff is really mostly inside baseball and how people are organized and incentives and how budgets work, right? So the more you can break down the channels, the more you can be customer first. People say that, but very few companies really are. But you need to understand what this means for your particular brand. Certain brands, like 80% of all product is researched online that's bought in the store. In other categories, grocery, there's not so much researching online, right? So you really got to drill this down for your particular business. But understand, consumers buy brands. They don't buy channels. And if you ask customers about channels, mostly they talk about YouTube or ABC or CNN or something. I know that's all. We're all talking to ourselves. Like customers don't talk about channels.
The fair call. It's anecdotal, but I'll give you an extreme example. Just happened to me. I received a catalog from a brand, saw a product I liked in a catalog that, to Tarek's point earlier, it's not like I thought I needed this product, but I saw the catalog. I liked what I saw. I went to their website on my phone, looked if they had local inventory available, and
Mhm.
then drove to the store on Saturday and tried it on and made a purchase.
Yeah,
Someone somewhere is claiming the credit for that transaction, and it's probably not the catalog person that inspired me to
right.
begin with, right? And so it's a good example of what you're describing. And then the last one that I'll bring forth here, and we'll close with a couple of the questions that we've received, is the coveted personalization and data challenge, right? So the question that was asked of these respondents was, which of the following personalized features have made you feel more connected to a brand when shopping online? And those answers were kind of in this order, largely, exclusive offers and discounts based on my shopping behavior, tailored loyalty rewards, personalized customer support, and personalized product recommendations. I'll actually ask Tarek a question on a topic that we haven't really spoken about yet. And this one is about AI, but not just, the traditional use cases of AI for product recommendations and things of that nature. Maybe AI for personalized customer support. How do you as an operator balance, I'm sure, what are a lot of customer support inquiries, considering how much you sell, coming to your site? How do you think about cost balancing versus personalizing that? How are you thinking about AI to optimize that and reduce risk?
Yeah, I think AI would be a whole kind of webinar for itself. I mean, just on the customer service topic, we are now answering, I think, 40%, 45% of our customer service requests by an AI. And it obviously is 99% cheaper than by a human, but it's also much better. I mean, that is so interesting because when we started, it was equally good, but cheaper. And now it's rated much higher because the customer gets much faster responses and the quality is I mean, I don't know, it's unfortunate for those that worked in that space, but actually the quality even already today, and we all know how fast these things advance, is better than what we saw before. So yeah, I mean, AI in customer service, I think, is an extremely obvious use case. For us, it saves already 7 million. That is 7 million more EBIT per year.
Mm.
So that is really real. I know a lot of people are talking about a lot of AI use cases that are more midterm, and I do believe it will really change the game. But I mean, the whole thing in customer service, that is just real today. Yeah.
That's amazing. So why don't we've got time for one audience question before closing. I'll start with you, Tarek. And Steve, feel free to add on. I get this a lot, and we got this as ahead of this webinar as well. Obviously about you today, Tarek is a generating billions of dollars in GMV annually. It obviously wasn't always like that. Going back in time, aside, what would you, change? What would you have done differently? What do you wish you could have changed that you've learned about since, aside maybe from hiring all those customer service people and replacing them with robots? What would you go back and change if you can do it again? And what lessons learned there?
Um, I mean, what for us was really a game changer, but that is maybe specific because we are a retailer, not a brand. So we do have own labels, but we are selling mostly wholesale goods, kind of from third-party brands, so Nike, Adidas, etc. Was we fairly fast actually transitioned to a marketplace, but if I would do it to a hybrid model, so edit the marketplace to a typical retail model. But if I would do it again, I would do it from day one. I mean, we all know that model from Amazon, and I think if you are kind of a multi-brand retailer, then hybrid is really the way to go, where you combine 1P, i.e. wholesale products, with a marketplace. And within marketplace, you have to have direct shipping as well as fulfillment by. Yeah, so these are the three sourcing models. And if you have these three sourcing models running, it sounds super operative now, but I mean, that gives your business such an efficiency while
Mm.
being able to expand your assortment into long tail categories. So I mean, if there's someone, a retailer out there, and obviously offline, you are just a pure 1P model because nothing else works. So what I often see is basically those with an offline heritage, when they set up an online shop, they are pure 1P and they kind of miss out the opportunity to become hybrid. It's not really a secret because a lot are obviously,
Yeah.
but I think I wouldn't underestimate the efficiency of having a hybrid model once it works, but it's quite
Mm.
complex to get it running. But then can give you a huge margin advantage. Yeah. But I mean, I could call out
That's
a lot.
great.
I would say for a retailer, at least, this was really a leapfrog in the ability to grow as well as being profitable.
Steve, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I'll come at it a little bit different way. I mean, the biggest thing I've learned, and of course I talk about and consult on a lot of this, is if I had to do it all over again, I would take more risk. I
Mm.
think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of risk among leaders and companies, that the kind of tried and true approach is the way to go. And I wrote a Harvard Business Review article about a year ago called "Safe is Risky." And when you look at a lot of the companies that are struggling, they have moved far too slow and they have aimed far too low in the delivery, the value they're trying to create. And some of that is actually quitting stuff, stopping doing stuff that is of marginal value. So now I spend a lot of time just thinking, what other things should I be doing, should my clients be doing, to try to move faster, because you just get run over in today's environment, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And it's not about being reckless, but whether you like it or not, if you see the companies that are struggling, they have moved way too slowly and focused on incrementalism, and incrementalism tends not to win.
Love it. Stephen, Tarek, I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us today. for those that are listening, for those that will be listening to the recording later on, we hope that this is the start of the conversation. Please do feel free to get in touch with Steve or myself. You can scan the QR codes to find us on the screen right there. And we would love to continue the dialogue. If there are specific questions have or specific topics you want to discuss with any one of us, we would welcome that conversation and look forward to speaking further. Thank you again. Cheers and happy selling out there. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.